Today, we are at Dyno Pro Inc. in Denver. We are checking out the 1.6 right now with my current turbo, fuel pump, manifold, etc. setup, seeing kind of what kind of numbers we can get. And then when I go to put in the future TDI motor, we'll have kind of like a baseline to compare things going forward, especially since this shop is close by to where I'm working, so we'll be able to come back and kind of actually evaluate what kind of modifications are doing what in terms of power numbers. Should be really cool. Car is already ready to go and on the dyno, and we already calibrated the RPM to the machine. So what we got to do to start is just a couple runs to see if we're getting consistent numbers at a certain level. So I might start off with kind of lower boost numbers just for those first runs. And then once we get those out of the way and we get a consistent result, we can actually start to play with things, and we'll probably turn up the boost and try a few things.
Just go graph it out.
That could be cool.
Did we just type into one of these vacuum lines right here?
Yeah, that's.
This is pull one off the T. If you, like this one doesn't have a zip tie. Can you pull that one off the T?
Yeah, do you have like another T we can put in? Oh, sick, yeah. Perfect.
Get you right size here.
Yeah, that's cool. Right on. Start up to or. My controller quite worked.
Yeah, I think we overboosted way more than you probably anticipated. What did you expect for boost?
I would say, me and my friend were screwing around with it and pretty much broke it last
I
night.
don't know, it's a diesel, so it's probably a lot more than most shit I'm used to seeing, but I'm showing 34 pounds.
Yeah.
Am I right?
I wasn't trying to. I was shooting for 20 as a warm-up though.
So that's why this number's higher than you expected.
Yeah, we overshot, which it may not work any better than that. We might get stuck with it being stuck like that.
So the bottom graph is your boost curve.
Yeah.
RPM's down here. This is horsepower, this is torque.
Hell yeah. Cool. There you go. Yeah. Accidentally. Worked better that time. It didn't overshoot so much.
What's that?
It didn't overshoot so much that time.
Turn it down.
Yeah. Definitely does smoke. I don't actually floor it very often while driving around. What?
You got 185 first pull with a 1.6 with blow by.
Yeah, I know, right? That was a good run.
3 runs, I can put torque up there. Just
Sure.
a lot of
So
lines.
green is what we just did.
Green is what we just did.
Interesting. So, yeah, so like really like 4,000 is where it's peaking anyways. So real quick, we're gonna do a run trying to make no boost, just to see like what the engine makes without the help of the turbo system, basically. Because it is a clapped bottom end, it has blow by and low compression, so I'm just curious what it makes without 35 psi of boost going to it. So here we go, these are the numbers. We made 200 horsepower, 274.9, call it 275 pound-feet of torque at 32.5 psi of boost, and our peak power-making RPM was right about 3,800 RPM. Pretty sweet. That's what it looks like. Okay, so that was pretty dang exciting, wouldn't you say? I was surprised what kind of numbers we got out of it, and while I was there, I didn't really do a whole lot of critical thinking. I was kind of too caught up in the fact that we made a decent looking dyno number for the first time and whatnot. But let's kind of unpack what just happened on the dyno a little bit by looking at a few of the graphs we made, which is the real reason for wanting to dyno the car at all, is you get a lot of information out of it. So yeah, peak numbers hypothetically was 200 horsepower and 175, am I making that up? Excuse me, 200 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque. For the record, when I'm opening these now after the fact, and I did see 200, now I'm only seeing like 198.39 and 267.74 for whatever reason. I don't know, but we'll kind of touch on that in just a second. So let's get into like what we got on the dyno. Let's look at these numbers a bit. Let's unpack what information we can kind of glean from them, and then kind of what inferences I can take from that in terms of what to do with the car next in terms of tuning. Here we go. So this is my dyno sheet. Let's just get you oriented to what's going on. I'm gonna move the cursor over here just to get out of the way. So dashed lines here are torque, solid lines are boost on the top graph only. This bottom graph is actually boost pressure. We managed to tee in the boost line while we were doing this, so we could get boost pressure mapped onto everything as well, which I'm super glad we did, for reasons I'll explain in just a second. So that's what's going on. That's the basic premise. So you can see a couple different things here. We got 3 runs currently mapped in. There's green, pink, and black. The black run was the best run of the day, which also was our 3rd run of the day. Our pink run was the 2nd run of the day, and that's just to show you some differences and to show trends. And the green run was the worst run of the day, and it's also where I purposely tried to make no boost in order to see what the engine itself was putting out for comparison. So let's just click around a little bit to start. So right here, this is like our peak torque number. I'm looking at this top dash line, and we made about, where is it, 273 pound-feet of torque. And by the way, this is horsepower, and this is the corrected number that we're currently looking at. Torque and also corrected number. And the corrected number just means the DynoJet software takes into account the atmospheric conditions that day, which I think we can even just look at. Not here, okay? I'm not very good with the software yet. At any rate, we had certain pressure and temperature conditions of the day, and the DynoJet software will adjust the runs, thus correct them, to be what's considered a standards or perfect day, where you're at sea level for air pressure, you have no humidity, and whatever. I think that's kind of it. Pressure, and temperature too. Whatever, probably like 70 degrees or something. I'll post in text what the numbers actually are that they correct to. At any rate, we didn't have a perfect day in Denver, so I think, for instance, this peak horsepower, so peak torque was about 273, and our peak horsepower was about 198.5. It, varies a little bit around here. At any rate, 198.5 was our peak horsepower, and that's corrected. So if later we switch to uncorrected horsepower, this is actually more like 165, because we're dynoing the car in Denver, which means we're at about 5,000 plus feet of elevation, which makes our air density much lower than sea level, and that accounts for a big horsepower drop. So at any rate, you can see we made about 200 horsepower as peak horsepower corrected, and we made about 273-ish pounds of torque, 275 corrected torque, which is awesome. That's great. But what's more interesting to me, those peak numbers are cool because I feel like, I guess to take a step back from looking at this too for just a second, looking at this data makes me really question the numbers we got on the Mustang dyno a while ago, and especially just reflecting on like how that session was run and how we were taken care of and how well the people who were dynoing the car seemed like they knew how to do that. I just don't feel like the number we got, like 80 horsepower a while ago, was really like a good number. Because the thing is, the way DynoJets work, or the way Mustang dynos work, is they actually have an electric motor that provides resistance, or a coil rather than a motor. At any rate, you can adjust that resistance because it's an electrical component. So depending on what the operator is doing and how much resistance they put on your car and how they set up all the parameters, you can get kind of drastically different results. Whereas a DynoJet is just 2 big drums that weigh 1,600 pounds total, and your car spins it up as fast as it can from one speed to another, and that's how they measure power there. So it's much more consistent in terms of not having the dynamometer itself being a variable in the equation. There is certainly a place for Mustang dynos. Like, a DynoJet is a mass that you spin it to a certain speed. It wouldn't be a good way of testing, the long-term stability of your engine or something like that, or your temperature, how much it can withstand temperature, or what temperature the oil gets to, because it's quick. You spin it up, and once it's spinning, that's it. Whereas a Mustang, you can load it up to the point where you could consistently have a car driving with a load on it at a certain speed and working against that load the whole time. And, that certainly has a time and place if you're testing different things. For the sake of getting a peak horsepower number that sweeps through RPMs, the DynoJet is really good and it's very consistent. So I'm glad we're working with that now instead of the Mustang. And it also just makes me, again, question the Mustang numbers, because it was a real shit show that day. We went in there in terms of how we were taken care of and how the session went. And so it makes me question, like, if they really knew what they were doing to begin with, especially with a front-wheel drive car instead of a diesel truck. Anyhoozle, back to looking at our current dyno chart. I want to just, so I pointed out like some peak numbers here, and this is at about, our peak boost on that run was about 32.2, which is also the highest recorded boost by the dynamometer we had on any given run. And what you should observe, and what is keenly different between the power we made in this run in black and the power we made in this run in pink, is actually the amount of boost we got. And the way the power comes on is almost, and goes off, is almost exactly correlated to what the turbo is doing. So you can see here, this pink run, I actually intentionally lowered the boost. You know, I was shooting for a max of about, there it says about 25. I think this run I was shooting for like 22 or something like that. The boost controller, you know, works okay, but it's not perfect. So it's probably shooting for like about 22. And at any rate, you can see that drastically influences our power number, making almost 10 pounds less of boost correlates to a drop of about, I don't know, what is that, like almost 50 horsepower, like 40, 44 or something like that. Like 45 horsepower drop just by dropping 10 psi of boost. So you can see that this car makes power from boost. Period. And then what's more interesting is these green runs down here are actually this is a run I tried to do no boost. So I left my VNT controller to basically hold the vanes wide open is what I was telling it to do, which we still made 5 pounds of boost by the end of the run right here. So you can see it's not a perfect representation of a naturally aspirated car because we still made boost pressure nonetheless. But you can see that power is dramatically different when there's not this huge spike of 30 psi that hits the engine. Instead, it's very much this flat line that slowly increases with RPM. And our peak power measured on the dynamometer, and this is again corrected, was about 72 horsepower and about 95, call it 100 pound-feet of torque. So we went from 70 horsepower at 5 psi to 200-ish horsepower at 32 psi. That is, I mean, that's astounding. That's a crazy difference. We added about 125 horsepower with about 30 pounds of boost additional over, you know, what we were starting with, or call it 28. That's crazy. So if nothing else, I definitely learned that like the way this car is responding is 100% to how much air you can get to it. And we're just looking at boost numbers here. Look at the air density video, see if that's any good too. On my actual screen readout measures air density. So we can assume that like it was a decently cold day. We had a fan right on the intercooler. We were probably getting pretty dense air at 32.2 psi. And I mean, it definitely shows it because we made a lot of power. But then, so that's just kind of analyzing peak numbers. And also just to give you the difference, we also made what? Between the pink run and the black run, so between 22 and 32 psi, that works out nice. We made 217 to 275, so like 55-ish pounds of torque, 55 foot-pounds of torque between a 10 psi gap. So that's crazy. Basically, for about every 10 psi we're adding, we're getting 50 foot-pounds and like 40 horsepower. So for 10 pounds of air, 40 more horsepower and 50 more pounds of torque. That's and so moving on from peak numbers, the interesting thing about all these graphs, and let me just again move the cursor out of the way, is that you'll see we had this swooping peak around 3,800 RPM, which is where peak horsepower was made. And initially at the dyno session, I was like, oh yeah, that's probably just because injection timing falls off after that. But the results could like be more contrary to that. I'm not saying timing doesn't play a role in the peak landing at 3,800. That probably is the sweet spot realistically. But what's obvious once you pull up the charts and look at them a little longer is that the horsepower we're making is 100% correlated to the shape of the boost. And that's kind of why I left this pink graph on here as a comparison, but also like look at how this graph looks, this curve, and then it dips. And what bothered me was that we made peak horsepower at 3,800 and then it like kind of dove down and then went back up again, then dove down again. And this last dive, like right here, I could fully see that being timing and fuel related because that's getting pretty high. That's at about 5139, so 5,140 RPM. You know, and that's a good amount of RPM for this mechanical fuel pump to be trying to keep up with. But what bothers me is we have this huge power dip. We dip back down to about 160 horsepower from 200 for a while before we go back up to about 175. And that kind of bothered me. And when you look at these graphs after the fact, though, it's very obvious that it's the work of the turbo and the boost we're making, and these curves, these dips and inconsistent horsepower numbers are very much a function of the VNT boost controller not operating optimally. So just before the dyno session, me and Dave got that rev limiter working, which was that short I posted, and there will be a full video on it at some point, but it immediately broke. We had it working for like a couple tries in his garage, and as soon as I pulled out and left, the rev limiter circuit fried, and it semi-fried like our other parts of the Arduino, and I feel like it semi-fried the Arduino itself potentially, maybe not, because it still works, but like glitchy works. And so I feel like the response we got on the dyno in this session is kind of a result of how that boost controller was responding. So you can see, and I'll pull up a video of what my dash controls are doing, but basically the car's recorded number right about here, what the controller, the boost controller, was seeing from its pressure sensor was 36 psi, and the limit was supposed to be 35, and then it was seeing 44 psi drive pressure, and the limit was supposed to be 35. So you can see we basically spiked. Oh geez, I don't know how to undo this. Oh man. Okay, we're back. You can basically see that like the boost controller saw those numbers which were over its limits and went, oh shit, and it took about this long to respond, you know, between here and here, which actually I'm pretty sure we can change this axis to time. Check that out. Now it's in seconds. So between here, which is about 2.6 seconds, and 3.7, so it took 1 full second for my Arduino controller to respond and make the linear actuator go the other way, at which point it overcompensated, and on the dash it read something like 32 psi, and then you can see it recompensated, and probably by about 5 seconds into the run, which also corresponds to about almost 5,000 RPM, so we're making about 1,000 RPM, no, more than that, whatever. At any rate, by the end of the run, it actually stabilized and was like hitting the boost target it thought it should be hitting. And that's what this kind of gross horsepower dip is in the first place, is the boost controller response kind of acting improperly, if anything. And it could be kind of laggy more than anything else. And then you can also appreciate that between here and here is turbo lag. Like it took 2.5 seconds to make peak horsepower off of a roll, and we started at about 2,000 RPM, which is like kind of a chillin'. So if you were like chillin', driving, matted on the floor to make peak horsepower, would be 2.5 seconds, and that's all turbo lag. 2.5 glorious seconds of nothing really happening. And so, you know, in the future, I hope to address that too. But for now, there's nothing you do about it because it's the same engine, and it's the same turbo, and it's the same fuel, and I'm not going to change any of it until I put the TDI in there. Now, when I do put the TDI motor in, that in and of itself should fix some of the lag because the TDI moves more air volume. We should see the turbo spool quite a bit faster than over the 1.6 liter, it being the same turbo. So those are kind of the observations, which leads me to next session of this video, which is speculation. And that's like, what can I adjust in order to go back and make a little bit more horsepower? And initially, this was it. I was just going to dyno it this one time, and then I was going to focus on my TDI, and then go back with my TDI and dyno that, so we can get a cool comparison between TDI and 1.6. And now, of course, that I have these charts in front of me and I can look at all these numbers and I can see exactly what's wrong and that our boost controller dumped a bunch of air, yada yada, I want to go back and I want to try to fix some things, and I also want to try measuring some other things now that I'm over the initial kind of excitement of a dyno session. Because I think the first one I was like, cool, we got numbers, I'm out of here. And now that I've had time to think about it, I'm like, you kidding me? We didn't test anything else while I was there? So when I'm going back, I would like to work on my settings within the boost controller to see if we can make more boost. Honestly, I'm probably just going to let it run as high as it wants. So I might set both limits to like 45 psi, or set drive to 50 and boost to 45, and just let the sucker make boost. I don't know. I don't think it's going to blow anything up necessarily to go that high, and I think based on how these charts look, the one-way ticket to making more horsepower is to boost the snot out of it. So I think if and when I go back to the dyno, I'll be trying more boost. And then the other thing that I really wonder about, and I think is interesting, is injection timing. And it's always been a subjective thing. Like I've posted quite a few videos of me trying different timing settings on my car, and it's always this kind of weirdly perceptive thing of me like being like, oh, I think it feels faster as I test drive it through traffic. Like, it's not a good way to compare things easily. So what I think I can do is, if I lay out a couple timing settings in the garage before I go, like I can measure what timing I want to try, move the pump to that, and then give myself a reference line to the pump and to like the bracket next to it, so that when I'm at the dyno session, all I have to do is loosen and move the pump, and I don't have to go through that long process of determining what that timing is. But I think it'd be really interesting to try 3 different timing settings, do my current setting, and all of them with the same amount of boost, ideally. But like, do my current setting, do a more retarded setting, and do a more advanced setting, and see what gives us the best curve. I have a feeling more advanced timing could be good for overall power numbers. But it'd be really interesting to see, how the boost is affected, how the power is affected, and we'll get to kind of brush the cobwebs off of those subjects. I feel like I've heard a lot of different fuel pump tuning beta in terms of like, oh, for peak horsepower, you want to be really advanced. Oh, for quick spool, you want to be retarded. And, sure, maybe those things are true. And I've even experienced the fact that if you slow your timing down, your turbo will spool faster. But I think it'd be really interesting to go and do them on the dyno and then actually have a chart to go and look at afterwards and see, oh yeah, this is exactly what it does. And like, here's a curve of the boost and how it responds. And here's the power curve and how it responds. And we can actually check out to see like how different timing settings will affect your car with a turbo, at least. Be very interesting. So that's what's coming. I want to try 3 timing settings and way more boost, not at the same time. Probably try the 3 timing settings first and then try way more boost with the setting that made the most power. So we can go for an even better top power number. I'd like to be, like we did have 200.00 at some point in the dyno session, and I can't bring it up on the chart now, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but, I'm saying I want to be solidly over. And the guy at the dyno shop made it happen, like, just to prove a point here. Prove a point. But like, whatever, I want to be solidly over 200, and I feel like given how that boost curve looks, if I can make more boost, if I can make 35 pounds of boost, like, we're gonna make even more horsepower and be cleanly into 200, and that would be sick. So I want to go back and do that for sure. So we're about to do a pull right now. I'm just kind of easing through the gears. I want you to pay attention to my Arduino readout, the first number 03 is boost, the second number is boost limit, and the third number is going to be my drive pressure. And then there's also boost and drive gauges on the left and right respectively. So you can see drive overshot and then came back. Let's go and just watch that one more time. Give us ourselves a little more time to see it. So here we go, we're running, and bam, on the Arduino we had 33 and 44, 33 pounds of boost, 44 PSI of back pressure. And also interesting to stop right here. Wait, let's go back just a little. Right. We'll stop here, so you can see we made at least 40 pounds on the gauge of drive pressure. And the Arduino readout actually lags a little bit because it has to update that screen. You can say we're at 40 of drive, but we're only about 25 PSI of boost right here. Boost then spikes up to about 30 on the gauge. And then the other interesting thing is we're watching the EGT gauge too, and it's steadily climbing through the pull, and we tap out right around 1300 degrees, which is actually pretty chill, but you could infer that if I shifted the car and continued to floor it, that needle would continue to climb. And this is kind of an interesting part of tuning, but also an interesting part of this car in general, is that I feel like while I am making a lot of horsepower on this 1.6 motor, if for some reason I went and tried to do this in a prolonged fashion, like if I actually took it to like a circle track or like a race track and was, flooring it out of every corner like you would a race car, I think it would blow up for sure. Mostly because our EGTs would be to the moon after like a few laps of that, and I think that would end up correlating to coolant temperature being high. In these runs, we don't get a high coolant temperature because the run is so short. But the other thing I'd like to do when I go back to the dyno is do fourth gear pulls. We'll do a third and a fourth gear pull. I want to compare the two. But I think I want to do fourth gear pulls for two reasons. Reason number one, which is kind of all the same reason, but it'll take longer to do the pull. In third gear, you can accelerate that drum faster, and it's a shorter pull. It's about 5 seconds. If we do that same pull on the same drum, but we go to fourth gear now, I don't know how much longer it's going to take, but we're giving your engine a greater disadvantage, so it will take longer because it's going to spin that thing up slower, which will be good for me for the two reasons being, one, we get kind of better data in terms of more of it. Like if it only took 5 seconds for the car to rev that drum up to 5,000 RPM, then maybe at fourth gear it'll take us, probably like 7 seconds or 8 seconds. I have no idea. But it will take longer, which will actually give us more data to look at. And the other thing that might be good about that is it might give the Arduino boost controller a chance to like catch up to what's happening in a more effective way. Whereas like third gear is just too fast. And it's technically faster than if I was out on the street too, where the car responds slightly differently because the drums weigh 1,600 pounds and my car weighs 1,800 pounds with me in it. So you figure, you're spinning that weight, but potato, basically you're moving a different amount of weight and the car is heavier. So third gear is longer when I'm on the street than when I'm on the dyno. And that I feel like is reflected in how the system was responding. And so when I go back, I kind of want to try testing in fourth gear this time, and that'll give us more time and a better chance for the Arduino to kind of catch up and do its thing. And it would just be interesting to see a contrast of those numbers. Kind of honing in on how to use the dyno best, basically. Anyways, so just kind of interesting to look at what we actually made on this particular poll, and kind of see what I was talking about in terms of that graphic, but then go ahead and see it. Let's see what my car is doing, what are the gauges doing in real life, and how do they correlate to that dyno sheet. And I hope between looking at the dyno sheet and watching this video, you have like a pretty good idea of what kind of data we're looking at. There you go, that was the poll. Oh, and the one other thing I wanted to talk about was the top right-hand corner on my Arduino readout. That's air density. So let me pause it when it's highest 10, 100, 146. So there you go, 236, and that's measuring pounds per cubic foot times 1,000. So if it was just pounds per cubic foot, it would technically be like 0.236 pounds per cubic foot. But it's pounds per cubic foot times 1,000 because it's easier to read. So normal ambient Denver air is about 22 pounds per cubic foot times 1,000. And you can see when I'm making, my Arduino's reading 33 pounds of boost. When I'm making 33 pounds of boost, the car is effectively seeing almost 236 pounds per thousand air density. However, my one caveat to saying that's how much it's making is that our thermocouple is actually pretty laggy too. And this is where pulling in a longer gear might actually be helpful in more than one way, is that if we walk, the number directly under the 236 is 57. That is the current temperature reading of the intake air in degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see 57 degrees at 33 pounds of boost. Plausible, but it realistically is probably lagging behind. And to show you my theory here, if I hit play, it's probably going to increase 60, 66, 69, 67, 74, 77, 78. So by the end of the poll in the video here, we're making about 78, call it 80 degrees intake air. And when that 236 pounds per thousand number cropped up, we were making, it was 57 degrees. So you can see the thermocouple actually lagged behind how much heat the turbo put through it. Like it had to heat up the metal of the thermocouple, and then it was reading what temperature it was making. So it's, the air density calculation on my dashboard is cool, but likely a better way to look at it would be to hand calculate it afterward and go, okay, we made 33 pounds of boost, and the intake air charge once the thermocouple caught up was actually 80 degrees, and then like let's calculate that now, you know, which is, I mean, there's not much to do about it. It's just an interesting number, kind of something to look at and call out, because I'll be using it further for tuning and to refer to, because making air density is kind of what's important. And for the record, when I recalculated the air density number using 80 degrees and 33 psi, that comes to around 240 pounds per cubic foot times 1,000. If anyone's geeking over there. Anyhoozle, so that was really fun and really cool, and more than anything, I'm stoked that we got some actual data out of it. You know, that I think is most important to me. Whether or not the data means my car actually makes 200 horsepower at sea level is kind of relatively important. What's more important is we have something to look at and something to compare to, and deficiencies detected via those numbers. And also, you know, I think I'll give myself a teeny tiny pat on the back here as well, because if we did make 200 horsepower on the 1.6, I mean, it's not all-time record, but that's right up there. I think realistically, if you threw a pair of compounds on this thing, you could make 250 horsepower. If you were pushing like 60 pounds of boost, you know, you'd probably make 250 horsepower, no problem. But something I kind of want to reiterate, I already touched on, is that realistically at that power number, it's not sustainable. Like, you can make 250 horsepower. Shit, maybe if you put a girdle on it and did a bunch of other crazy stuff, you could make 300 horsepower on it. But the reality is you're going to put out way too much heat for that engine, that casting, and for that cooling system, the way the head's set up, all of it, and it's going to overheat and it's going to break, and it's not going to give you any sustainable power. Now, I guess if you were making a drag racing 1.6, then that's might be okay, but even drag racing, at 250 horsepower 1.6 would probably make it down the track in like 13 seconds or something. That's still 13 seconds of being fully on it the whole time. That's honestly enough to break something too. So I think that's an interesting thing to ponder and reflect on. And, you know, I think transitioning to the ALH makes a lot of sense, because more than anything, it's just stronger. I think it'd be cool to make more power. I'd love to make 300 horsepower on my ALH if I can do 200 on my 1.6. But I think what's important is it's stronger and it's a little bit newer, and the way the water jacket works is better. and it has a much stronger chance of surviving like kind of extended sessions of abuse than the 1.6 does. Whereas I think I abused the 1.6 for an extended period of time at its max power, it'd probably like split the block in half or something would melt. At any rate, but I'm stoked we made that number. That's great. I mean, you put a big turbo and big pipes and lots of fuel. If you put it all to it, I mean, there you go. You can do it. And that's with like stock injectors too. I don't have fancy nozzles or anything. So there's more you could do, but my kind of answer to the implicit question of should you do more is like probably not worth it. So I'm going to do a little bit more kind of testing and tweaking, probably in a future dyno session, just to kind of get some good information for everybody and myself included on like how this thing responds to certain conditions. And then going forward, it'll be ALH time. And that'll be cool because then we'll get to retest and see for the exact same setup, how much more power does an ALH block get you? We'll find out. Coming here. Sometime soon-ish. It's going to take a while to put that thing together. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting. Appreciate ya.